Hi. So first of all, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. You should all now, I think, be able to see my screen. Yeah, I can see some nods, that's fine. So yeah, very much as David said, I really just want to give sort of a little bit of a historical context to this. I work on the historical dimensions of basically some of what is happening today. And I've got a really strong interest in the ways in which sort of history is used and abused in political discourse and online Islamophobia in the Chinese context in the present. I should also state that my remarks today are largely about the Chinese-speaking Muslims, and I'm leaving the history of Xinjiang, Uyghurs, and Turkic speakers to my more qualified colleagues who are following. So it's a stupidly simple point, but I think it is worth stressing actually, is that there have been Muslims in China for a really, really long time. There's been Muslims in China for about 1,000 years, arrived as migrants through trade, alongside the Yuan dynasty in a lot of places, and many were converts as well. But scholars estimate that Chinese had become the dominant daily use language for what we now call the Hui, the Chinese Muslims, by about the Ming dynasty. Which is to say that there's also a really long tradition of mosque architecture within China. And often in the regions that I work on, the mosques are very much some of the oldest buildings left. They predate everything else around them. And that there is actually what we could describe as perhaps a distinct tradition of Chinese mosque building. But hang on a moment, there we go. So yes, this is one of my favorite mosques. This is in Shanghai. And I just wanted to show this to give you an idea of what some of this actually looks like. Features I'd point out from this particular mosque, like you have the very distinctive sort of minaret with Chinese style sort of peaked eaves, sort of these distinctive sloping prayer halls. And out front, you have features like the shield wall and all the rest of it. And this mosque is about 18th century. This is not to elide sort of the rest of like the history of Islam in China. The really old mosques in the East are different. And there's variety everywhere, but nevertheless, like these are the kind of mosques that are often described as being syncretic. I'm not sure I like the way that sets up a binary between Chinese and Muslim, but it's quite useful to note the way in which they resemble sort of other historical religious architecture. They were part and parcel of a very diverse religious landscape. And as some of my other colleagues who focus on history, particularly Tristan and Brown, have emphasized, they fitted into this landscape as well. And official pronouncements at the moment would sort of have us believe that this is evidence of praiseworthy Sinicization, if you like, of evidence of an Islam that did accommodate itself to local conditions. And using that partly almost in the rhetoric as justification for this campaign to take away these foreign elements that are taking, apparently corrupting these communities. I should also stress though that perhaps despite the rhetoric, the action at the moment strongly suggests that whatever the rhetoric says, there is no form of Islam Chinese enough to survive. In practice, there is very little space being left. But to return to that idea of a history of Sinicization, the truth is, as ever, perhaps a little bit more complicated. There's never really been a single Chinese Islam. It's always been quite a diverse field, quite varied histories. But I'd like to stress that these questions over what it means to be Chinese and Muslim, or questions of what a Chinese Islam should be like, which lead up to sort of the contemporary Sinicization campaign, are in some senses very, very modern ones. I don't know if it would have occurred always to people to frame them in that way. And so I'd like to take a step back very briefly to sort of some of the older histories of Sinicizing Islam. So across the 18th and 19th century, you see rising discrimination against Muslims, probably occasioned by socioeconomic change and basically an increasing degree of impoverishment. That results in Muslim rebellions in the Northwest and Southwest, partly as a result of that economic distress, partly as a result of that discrimination. And in the wake of, oh, that's a different mosque, my apologies. More different mosques, a variety of what Islam in China can look like. So to return to rising discrimination. In the wake of those, and this is a decision that I think has consequences that live on, a certain subset of Qing officials promote what can be termed the Confucianization of Chinese Muslims. In the wake of rebellions, you see which occur in the middle of the 19th century, you see strict controls on mosque building. Others are confiscated, turned into shrines and academy, often on the grounds that they'd harbored rebels or set themselves up above the imperial state, and a history of late 19th century campaigns, particularly against Sufi organizations seen as being heterodox. And the image you see there is from a photograph of a gate taken in the 1930s that says, "Do not divide Chinese and Muslim," a slogan from part of those campaigns. The Republican period sees, basically with the rise of nationalism, sort of a generalized set of questions about sort of what being Chinese would mean, and questions then about also correspondingly at the same time, questions of what being Muslim might mean. And it's a period of quite intense change in global ideas of what it meant to be Muslim and ideas of what it meant to be Chinese as well. So there are connections to global movements sort of across the board. Muslims in China traveling abroad, the rise of new modernist nationalist forms of Islam in China, and tensions there about what Islam is going to look like within Chinese communities. So reprints for correct Arabic pronunciation, against incense burning, mosques to be reorientated, even as other groups argue for basically the reprinting of Sino-Islamic texts. And there's this question, therefore, of like with the new Republican state, which is formally speaking atheist, like where then is religion going to fit in? And so you see here briefly a selection of men who studied in Egypt at the time, sort of key reformers of what Islam was going to be. And leading into sort of the Maoist period, again, through the 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗄𝗁 period, we return almost and back to my favorite mosque, where you can still see the Maoist slogans along the wall. Once again, after the communists win, throughout the 𝗖𝗵𝗶𝗄𝗁 period, mosques are closed, many are demolished, others converted into storehouses, imams imprisoned, and there's a really lasting memory of those times in Chinese Muslim communities. And the importance here too, I would stress, of forms of narratives about Sinicization, particularly in the development of ethnic minority studies and thinking about how ethnic minorities, which Muslims are now defined as, should relate to the state. During reform and opening, mosques are re-established. Basically, religious professionals are released, and there's a certain amount of politicking between different Chinese Islamic groups or relationships with the state. But the key thing I'd like to stress here is that basically it was a point of pride for Muslim communities to re-establish themselves, rebuild their traditions after the closures of the Maoist period. And there's a boom in mosque building, much of which takes patterns from abroad, ideas of what a mosque is going to look like. A re-establishment process. And so I would not, however, state that that necessarily says anything about their orientation to the wider state, but it is part of those communities orientating themselves within wider discourses of what it means to be Chinese and what it means to be Muslim. And I don't think a straight line can be drawn between response to Muslim rebellions in the 19th century, to Maoist campaigns against religion, to campaigns for the Sinicization of Islam in the present. Despite some of the similarities, these are movements that come from quite profoundly different places. But it does add up to a tradition that is being drawn on in state rhetoric. Those histories remain as reservoirs of rhetoric. For example, the policymakers, Islamophobes, and Chinese Muslims are all drawing on in the present. And they frame a lot of the way in which the response in Chinese Muslim communities to this current campaign for Sinicization is taking place.